placed a sun inside my spirit, a blazing truth that never fades, a moon to move my quiet waters, a star to guide me through the shade. Day and night both bend around me, rhythm dancing in my bones. Seasons shift but never shake me. I walk in wisdom fully grown. You wrote my timing in the sky. You set the pace for how I rise. Lights in my sky. Constellations in my veins, a holy compass in my ribcage, a sacred rhythm in my name. You made my soul a universe where revelation blooms and spins. My soul reflects the heaven within. You move me like the moonlight. You hold me like the sunrise. You guide me with the starlight. You awakened all my insides. You shine on me. Sun in my spirit, moon in my soul, stars in my voice, stars in my voice. Sun in my spirit. Stars in my voice.
Hello, family. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the most fascinating books in the entire Bible, which is the book of Esther. What makes this book unique is something many people have never noticed. The name of God never appears in the story, not once. And yet, when we read the narrative carefully, we begin to see something extraordinary. Even when God is not mentioned, divine wisdom, justice, and alignment are quietly unfolding behind the scenes. The story begins in a royal palace where power, pride, and control dominate the environment. A king rules with absolute authority. Advisors manipulate decisions. Policies are written that affect entire nations. And within this system, we encounter a woman named Esther, a woman who rises from obscurity into a position of influence. But the book of Esther is not simply about palace politics. It reveals something much deeper. It shows us how systems of power can be challenged, how injustice can be exposed, and how courage in the right moment can shift the course of history. Throughout this teaching, we will walk verse by verse through the story, uncovering patterns that are still visible in our world today. Because Esther is not just ancient history, it is a mirror that reveals how power operates, how injustice spreads, and how truth can eventually bring restoration. So, take a breath, settle in, and let's walk through this remarkable story together. Esther 1 verse 1. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. The story begins by introducing the king and the vast size of his empire. The empire stretches across 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. The narrative immediately establishes power and scale. This is one of the largest empires in the ancient world. The author sets the stage inside an environment of immense political power. This would be similar to opening a story inside the White House, a global corporation, a multinational government system. The narrative begins at the highest level of power and authority. Esther 1 verse 2. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, the king rules from Susa, the capital city. The citadel represents the center of political authority. Everything in the empire flows outward from this place. This is like a national capital city, a corporate headquarters, the central command of an organization. The decisions made here affect millions of people. Esther 1:3. In the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The king hosts a massive banquet for government officials, military leaders, and nobles. The feast represents display of power and influence. It is not just a celebration. It is a demonstration of authority. Kings often use feasts to show their wealth and reinforce loyalty among leaders. This is similar to global leadership summits, corporate conventions, state banquets. These events often function as displays of status and influence. Esther 1:4. While he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom, the king displays the wealth of his empire. The feast lasts 180 days. The narrative emphasizes excess and display. This shows a culture centered on prestige and power. We see similar displays today when corporations showcase massive wealth. Nations display military strength. Influential figures highlight luxury and status. It reflects the human tendency to measure importance through visible success. Esther 1:5. When these days were completed, the king gave a feast lasting 7 days. After the long celebration for officials, another feast is held for everyone in the palace. The story continues building the image of a lavish environment of excess. 7 days also introduces a complete cycle. Large organizations often celebrate milestones with public events to reinforce loyalty and unity. Esther 1:6. The palace decorations are described as white cotton curtains, purple fabrics, silver rings, marble pillars, and golden couches. The narrative paints a vivid picture of luxury. The author wants the reader to feel the opulence of the empire. This mirrors environments of extreme wealth today. Luxury resorts, elite corporate events, high-level political gatherings. The story intentionally contrasts powerful environments with fragile leadership. Esther 1:7-8. Guests drink from golden vessels, each unique. The king allows everyone to drink freely. The environment becomes increasingly indulgent. The atmosphere is one of unchecked luxury and pleasure. Power structures often become vulnerable when leadership is surrounded by indulgence, ego reinforcement, and lack of accountability. This prepares the stage for the crisis that follows. Esther 1:9. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women. While the king hosts the men, Vashti hosts a banquet for the women. This establishes that Vashti also has status and authority. She is not merely passive, she holds her own gathering. Esther 1:10-11. The king commands Vashti to appear before the guests wearing the royal crown. The purpose is to display her beauty. The request reflects the king's desire to display possession and prestige. Vashti becomes an object meant to enhance the king's status. Modern parallel. Power structures sometimes treat people as symbols of status rather than individuals with autonomy. Esther 1:12. The king sends messengers commanding Vashti to appear before the guests so that her beauty can be displayed. Vashti refuses. The king becomes furious. This refusal shocks the royal court because the empire is built on absolute authority. A command from the king was expected to be obeyed immediately. Vashti's refusal disrupts the entire structure of power. One simple word no shakes the authority of the empire. The advisors panic, not because of Vashti alone, but because they fear what her refusal represents. If one woman refuses the command of a king, what happens? If others begin to do the same? This is why the advisors say her action could spread across the empire. Her refusal becomes a symbolic challenge to the status quo. This moment is deeply relatable in modern life. Sometimes, systems operate on unspoken expectations. Follow the norm. Don't question authority. Don't disrupt the structure. But occasionally, someone decides to stand up and say, I will not go along with this. We see this today when an employee challenges unethical practices at work. When someone refuses to participate in harmful social expectations. When a person stands up for their dignity instead of complying with pressure. When someone chooses integrity instead of approval. In those moments, the refusal can feel small, but it often shakes the structure more than people expect. Why the story begins with Vashti? This moment is extremely important for the narrative because Vashti's refusal creates the vacancy that Esther will later fill. Without this moment of disruption, the rest of the story would not unfold. So, the book begins with a simple but powerful event. Someone refusing to comply with a system. And that refusal opens the door for a completely new chapter in the story. Esther 1:13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment. After Queen Vashti refuses the king's command, the king does not immediately decide what to do. Instead, he consults his advisors. the wise men who understand law and custom. These men function as the king's policy advisors and legal experts. They help determine how the empire should respond. Structurally, this verse shows how large systems operate. Major decisions are rarely made alone. Leaders consult advisors, experts, legal specialists, and policymakers. The phrase "who understood the times" suggests that these were individuals skilled at interpreting social and political situations. They were essentially strategists. Modern relatable examples. This moment resembles situations like corporate setting. A CEO calls a meeting after a major issue arises in the company. Executives gather to discuss what happened, how it affects the organization, and what action should be taken. Next example, church setting. A church board meets after a controversial situation. Leaders discuss how to address the issue, how it affects the congregation, and what message should be communicated. Government setting. A president or prime minister consults advisors after a crisis. They evaluate the situation and determine the official response. Why this matters in the story? The king's advisors are not just discussing Vashti's refusal. They are concerned about how the situation could affect the entire empire. They fear the refusal might encourage others to challenge authority. So, the conversation quickly becomes about maintaining social order. This verse reveals something important about power structures. When the status quo is challenged, systems often respond by gathering decision makers to control the outcome. A single act of resistance can trigger an entire institutional response. The king commands Vashti to appear before the guests so that her beauty can be displayed. From the king's perspective, this probably seemed normal. He does not appear to question the request. He does not examine whether the request might be humiliating or disrespectful. To him, the problem is not the request. The problem is the refusal. So, when Vashti refuses, he becomes furious. The advisors also miss the real issue. The advisors never question whether the king's request was inappropriate. Instead, they focus entirely on Vashti's response. They interpret her refusal as a threat to authority. So, the conversation becomes about controlling behavior rather than examining the original action. In other words, the system does not question the behavior of power. It only reacts to the person who challenged it. This is exactly what the teaching of Jesus addresses when he says, "Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the beam in your own?" The point of that teaching is about self-awareness. Human beings often notice the faults of others while remaining blind to their own behavior. Many systems operate this way. People often react strongly to the person who challenges the structure, while rarely examining the behavior that triggered the challenge. Examples appear everywhere. Workplaces focusing on the employee who spoke up rather than the issue raised. Institutions reacting to criticism rather than examining their actions. Social systems defending tradition rather than questioning whether the tradition is harmful. In many cases, the person who points out the issue becomes the problem. Why this matters for the story? The author of Esther never explicitly criticizes the king, but the structure of the story allows the reader to notice something. The empire is powerful, but it is also blind to its own flaws. And this blindness sets the stage for the events that follow. Because later in the story, another figure within the empire will face a similar blindness. That figure is Haman. And just like the king in chapter 1, Haman will become unable to see the flaws in his own behavior. Chapter 1 quietly asks a profound question. When conflicts arise, do we examine the situation honestly? Or do we simply react to the person who challenged us? The story invites readers to consider whether the real problem is always the person who refuses, or sometimes the system that never stopped to examine itself. Esther 1 verse 15 to 16. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus. The Memucans said before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people. The king asked his advisors what should be done about Vashti's refusal. One of the advisors, Memucan, speaks first. He claims that Vashti's action is not just an issue between her and the king. He expands the problem and says her refusal affects everyone in the empire. Structurally, this moment shows how institutions often react when authority is challenged. Instead of treating the situation as a personal disagreement, the advisor reframes it as a threat to the entire system. Vashti's refusal becomes exaggerated into something much larger. The logic becomes, if one person refuses authority, others might follow. Therefore, the system must respond strongly. Modern relatable examples. This is exactly what happens in many modern settings. Workplace example. Imagine an employee refusing to go along with something they believe is wrong. Management may hold a meeting to discuss the employee's behavior, how it affects company culture, and whether discipline is necessary. The conversation often shifts from one person's action to protecting the organization's authority. In a church environment, if a member challenges leadership or raises concerns, the leadership team may gather to discuss how the situation affects the church, whether the challenge threatens unity, and how to respond publicly. The focus may shift from the issue itself to maintaining order within the institution. Organizational culture. This happens in many organizations. When someone challenges the status quo, leaders sometimes frame the issue as protecting the system, maintaining authority, preventing others from following the same example. What the story is showing. These verses reveal something about how power structures operate. When authority is challenged, systems often respond by expanding their perceived threats. A personal refusal becomes a systemic problem, and once the issue is framed that way, the response becomes much stronger. This moment raises an interesting question. When someone stands up against a system, is the reaction truly about the action itself, or about the fear that others might begin to question the system as well? The book of Esther quietly exposes how institutions sometimes react when their authority is challenged. Esther 1 verse 17 to 18. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. The advisor Memucan continues speaking. He claims that if Vashti's refusal goes unpunished, women throughout the empire will hear about it. According to him, they will begin to challenge their husbands. He predicts widespread disrespect and disorder across the kingdom. So, the advisors present Vashti's action as something that could destabilize the entire social structure. This is a classic example of institutional escalation. one event is expanded into a much larger perceived threat. Instead of saying, Vashti refused the king, the advisors say, this could affect the entire empire. The problem becomes magnified. This is a strategy often used when systems feel their authority is being challenged. By enlarging the perceived danger, leaders justify stronger action. This pattern is extremely familiar today. In the workplace, an employee challenges leadership. Instead of framing it as one disagreement, management might say, if we allow this, everyone will start questioning authority. Suddenly, the issue becomes about maintaining order across the entire organization. In church environment, a member raises concerns about a leadership decision. Leadership may respond by saying, if we allow this type of challenge, it will create division in the entire church. The situation becomes framed as a threat to unity. Institutional systems. Many organizations react similarly. A single act of resistance becomes described as something that could spread across the organization, weaken authority, and disrupt the structure. So, the conversation shifts from the individual act to protecting the system. What the narrative is showing. The story reveals something about how power structures protect themselves. When authority is challenged, leaders often predict widespread disorder. But sometimes, the real concern is not chaos. The real concern is losing control of the narrative. This moment raises an interesting reflection. When systems react strongly to one act of defiance, we might ask, is the response about the action itself or about the fear that the action might inspire others? The book of Esther quietly exposes how institutions sometimes respond when their authority is questioned. These verses prepare the ground for what comes next. The advisors will recommend a drastic solution: remove Vashti as queen. But ironically, that decision will open the door for someone else to rise. Someone whose role will eventually change the course of the story. Esther 1 verse 19. If it please the king, let a royal command go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repelled, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal permission to another who is better than she. After predicting that Vashti's refusal could spread across the empire, the advisors proposed a solution. They recommend issuing a permanent decree removing Vashti from her position as queen. They also recommend replacing her with another woman. So, the response to the challenge is removal, replacement, legal reinforcement of authority. This verse shows how systems sometimes react. When someone is perceived as threatening the established order, rather than simply resolving the disagreement, the response becomes institutional removal. The advisors want the decision written into law so it cannot be reversed. This transforms a personal conflict into a legal precedent. Modern relatable examples. When individuals challenge institutions, the response can sometimes include losing their job, being removed from leadership, being ostracized socially, being excluded from organizations, being excommunicated from religious communities. In many cases, the justification is similar to what we see in Esther. The person is framed as a threat to the structure. So, the system acts to remove the perceived threat and restore order. The irony of the story. What makes this moment fascinating is that the decision to remove Vashti actually sets the stage for the rest of the story. By removing one queen, the empire unknowingly creates a vacancy, and that vacancy will eventually be filled by Esther. The very decision meant to restore control will eventually open the door for a sequence of events the king and his advisors never anticipated. Sometimes, systems believe they are protecting themselves by removing someone. But history often shows that those moments of disruption can become the very events that reshape the future. The removal of Vashti may have appeared like the end of her story, but in reality, it was the beginning of a much larger story unfolding. Esther 1 verse 20. So, when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, all women will give honor to their husbands, both great and small. The advisors recommend sending a decree across the entire empire. The message of the decree is meant to reinforce the authority of men within households. Because the empire is vast, the order must be proclaimed publicly throughout every province. This verse shows something interesting about power. When authority feels threatened, systems often try to restore order through rules and policies. Instead of addressing the specific situation, the empire issues a decree meant to regulate behavior across the entire society. The reaction reveals a deeper concern. Leaders fear that one act of resistance could influence many others. We often see this pattern today. Sometimes, a single incident leads institutions to introduce new policies. Examples include companies creating new rules after workplace disputes, organizations issuing new policies after internal conflict, churches introducing stricter governance after a challenge to leadership. The intention is usually to restore order and prevent similar situations from happening again. Esther 1:21. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. The king accepts the advisor's recommendation. He approves the plan to remove Vashti and issue the decree. This shows how leadership decisions often emerge from group consensus among advisors. Once the advisors agree, the king formalizes the decision. The system moves forward with the proposed solution. This is similar to decision-making processes in corporate boards, government cabinets, and church leadership councils. A proposal is discussed, approved, and then implemented. Esther 1:22. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every people in their own language. The king sends written decrees across the entire empire. Each province receives the message in its own language. This ensures that the policy is communicated clearly throughout the kingdom. The empire's response shows how centralized authority spreads its decisions through communication networks. The decree is distributed widely to maintain consistency across the empire. Modern parallel. This resembles how large organizations communicate policies today. Examples include company-wide emails announcing new rules, government legislation communicated to states or provinces, denominational statements sent to churches. Once leadership decides something, the information spreads through the organization. Moving on to chapter 2. Esther 2 verse 1 to 4. After Vashti is removed, some time passes. The king's anger settles. He remembers what happened with Vashti. But instead of reflecting deeply on the situation or reconsidering the decision, the advisors suggest a solution. Find another queen. Gather young women from across the empire. Select a replacement, and the king agrees. The story reveals a pattern that appears in many areas of human life. Rather than examining the root of the conflict, the system moves quickly toward replacement. The underlying issue is not explored. No one asks, was the original request appropriate? Could the situation have been handled differently? What role did the king play in the conflict? Instead, The focus becomes replace the queen and move forward. This pattern appears in many areas of life. 1. Relationships and marriage. When conflicts arise, sometimes people respond by leaving the relationship and seeking another partner rather than examining the deeper issues. The assumption becomes, if I find someone else, the problem will disappear. But often, the same patterns repeat because the root issue was never addressed. Institutions. Organizations sometimes respond to conflicts the same way. Instead of examining structural problems, they may simply replace individuals. Examples include firing an employee without addressing the system that caused the issue, removing a leader without examining the organizational culture, replacing one pastor or leader without addressing deeper concerns in the community. The surface problem changes, but the deeper pattern remains. On a personal level, people sometimes move from situation to situation, hoping the next environment will solve their discomfort. But growth often requires reflection. What role did I play in this situation? What the story quietly reveals. The narrative of Esther does not openly criticize the king, but the structure allows the reader to notice something important. The king moves forward without examining his own behavior. The system simply replaces Vashti, and the story continues. Yet, this pattern of unexamined power and pride will appear again later in the book through another character, Haman. Just like the king in chapter 1, Haman will also struggle to see his own flaws. This part of the story invites an honest question. When problems arise in our lives, do we pause to examine our role in what happened? Or do we move quickly toward replacement and escape? The book of Esther quietly encourages readers to consider the difference between moving on and growing through reflection. Esther 2 verse 5. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. The story now introduces Mordecai, a Jewish man living in the capital city of the empire. He belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. He lives inside the same city where the king rules. The narrative shifts perspective. Until now, we have been seeing the story from the palace level. Now, the focus moves to ordinary individuals living within the empire. This change in perspective is important. Great events in history often involve people who initially appear unnoticed. In large systems today, governments, corporations, institutions, there are often individuals whose role is not visible at first. Yet, those individuals sometimes become central figures in important moments. Many stories of influence begin with people who appear ordinary. Esther 2 verse 6. Who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives. Mordecai's family had been taken into exile when Jerusalem was conquered. He is living far from the original homeland of his people. This verse reminds readers that the Jewish people in the story are living in exile. They are not in positions of national power. They are minorities living within a much larger empire. Modern parallel. Many people today live and work in environments where they are part of a minority group or community. They must navigate systems that were not originally built around them. This story reflects the experience of living within a larger structure while maintaining identity. Esther 2:7. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, for she had neither father nor mother. Esther is Mordecai's cousin. She is an orphan. Mordecai raises her as his own daughter. The text also mentions that she was beautiful. The narrative introduces the future queen in a very humble position. She is an orphan, raised by a relative, living quietly in the empire. The story intentionally contrasts this with the powerful palace environment we saw earlier. This is a recurring pattern in scripture. Important figures often begin in unexpected circumstances. Many influential people begin their journey in modest circumstances. Some grow up without significant resources or connections. Yet, their character, preparation, and opportunities later shape their path. This story reminds readers that beginnings do not always determine outcomes. These verses invite readers to notice something important. Sometimes, the individuals who later influence history begin their journey quietly. They are not always the most powerful people in the room. Sometimes, they are simply living their lives, unaware that the circumstances around them are preparing them for a moment that has not yet arrived. Esther 2 verse 8. So, when the king's order and decree were proclaimed, and many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel, Esther also was taken into the king's palace. After After the decree to find a new queen, many young women from across the empire are brought to the palace. Esther is among them. She enters the royal system. Notice the wording. Esther was taken. She did not pursue the palace. She was drawn into the process. The narrative shows how individuals sometimes become part of larger events that they did not initiate. This can happen in many ways today. Someone unexpectedly recruited for a major opportunity. Someone being placed in a position they did not actively seek. Circumstances bringing someone into an environment they never planned for. Sometimes, life places people in situations before they understand why. Esther 2:9. The young woman pleased him and obtained his favor. Esther gains favor with Hegai, the official responsible for the women. He treats her kindly and provides her with special care. Favor appears repeatedly in Esther's story. This suggests that her character, demeanor, or presence made a positive impression on others. The narrative shows doors opening quietly for her. Modern parallel. This happens often in professional environments. Someone may gain the trust of supervisors or colleagues because of qualities like humility, reliability, kindness, and professionalism. Opportunities often grow from the way people interact with others. Esther 2:10. Esther had not yet revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Mordecai instructs Esther to keep her Jewish identity hidden. She follows his instruction. This introduces the theme of concealed identity, which becomes central to the entire book. Esther is inside the palace, but her true background remains unknown. The story is setting up a moment when this hidden identity will eventually become important. Modern parallel. Many people navigate environments where they carefully manage what aspect of their identity they reveal. For example, someone working in a setting where their cultural background is different from the majority. Individuals choosing when to disclose personal beliefs or experiences. People balancing different parts of their identity in professional environments. This story reflects the complexity of living within larger systems. Esther 2:11. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Mordecai checks on Esther daily. He remains concerned for her well-being. Mordecai plays the role of a guardian and observer. Though he is outside the palace, he remains connected to Esther's journey. This relationship becomes important later in the story. Modern parallel. Many people succeed in challenging environments because they have support systems, mentors, family members, or trusted friends often provide guidance and encouragement behind the scenes. Even when someone enters a new environment, the support of others can remain a powerful influence. This part of the story reveals something profound about preparation. Esther enters the palace quietly. She does not yet know the role she will eventually play. But the narrative suggests that the circumstances unfolding around her are preparing her for a moment that has not yet arrived. Sometimes, people find themselves in places where they do not yet understand the purpose of their presence. Yet, those environments may be shaping the very moment when their influence will matter most. Esther 2:12. Now when the turn came for each woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after she had completed 12 months of preparation. Before any woman could appear before the king, she had to go through 12 months of preparation. The preparation included 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. Only after this process could she meet the king. The narrative highlights a long preparation before opportunity. No one simply walks into the palace and becomes queen. There is a process. The number 12 in scripture often represents a full cycle or structure. The 12 disciples, the 12 tribes of Israel. So, this verse reflects the idea that preparation happens over time before major transitions occur. This pattern is extremely familiar today. Before major opportunities, there is often a long season of preparation. Examples include years of education before a career, training before leadership roles, internships before full employment, practice before public recognition. Many people see the moment of success, but not the preparation that preceded it. Esther 2:13. Then the young woman would go into the king. After preparation, each woman was given the opportunity to appear before the king. She could take whatever she wanted from the women's quarters to present herself. Each candidate presents herself individually. This moment reflects personal presentation and readiness. The preparation period leads to a moment of evaluation. Modern parallel. This resembles situations like job interviews, auditions, leadership selections, and professional presentations. After long preparation, people often face a moment where their readiness is evaluated. Esther 2:14. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return. After meeting the king, the woman would move to another area of the palace. Unless the king specifically called for her again, she would not return. This meant that for many women, the opportunity would come only once. 12 months of preparation with only one opportunity. That's why we say what first impression matters. This part of the story reflects the uncertainty of opportunity. Many individuals may go through preparation, yet only one will become queen. The narrative shows the reality of selection within systems of power. More relatable examples. This happens often in life. For example, hundreds of candidates applying for a single job. Many entrepreneurs pitching for one investment opportunity. Numerous applicants competing for limited positions. Many people prepare, but only a few are chosen. This part of the story invites an important reflection. Many people desire opportunity and influence, but often the most significant moments of opportunity come after long seasons of preparation that few people see. Esther's story reminds us that preparation often precedes purpose. Sometimes, individuals are being prepared for roles they do not yet understand. Esther 2:15. Now when the turn came for Esther, she asked for nothing except what Hegai advised. When Esther's time arrives to meet the king, she does something different from the others. Instead of requesting many items to present herself, she simply follows the advice of Hegai, the palace official. The text says she found favor with everyone who saw her. This verse highlights Esther's humility and wisdom. She does not attempt to impress through excess. She listens to guidance and carries herself in a way that naturally gains the goodwill of others. The narrative suggests that her presence and character were noticeable. This is very relatable in professional and social settings. Sometimes, people believe success comes from trying to impress others through display. But often, what stands out more is authenticity, humility, wisdom to listen, and learning from those with experience. People who are teachable often gain the trust of those around them. Esther 2:16. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in the 10th month. See another number. As we've been seeing across scripture, 10 often marks completion of a cycle before something new is established. So in Esther, the 10th month is not just a date. It signals the completion of Esther's preparation, the transition into elevation, the beginning of her new role as queen. Before this moment, Esther had gone through a long process, removed from her normal life, placed in the palace system, prepared over time, refined quietly behind the scenes. By the time we reach the 10th month, everything is ready. The hidden message in Esther. Esther didn't become queen randomly. Her elevation came after a complete cycle of preparation. This is important because the story shows timing matters, preparation matters, alignment matters. This is very relatable. Sometimes people feel like nothing is happening. I'm just preparing. I'm just waiting. But there are seasons where everything is being quietly aligned behind the scenes. Then suddenly, an opportunity opens. Recognition comes. Elevation happens. And it looks sudden, but it was actually prepared over time. The 10th month in Esther reflects a pattern we see throughout scripture. Before elevation, there is preparation. Before transition, there is completion. Esther's story shows that what looks like a sudden breakthrough is often the result of a hidden process reaching its full measure. Life often has moments like this. After years of preparation, there may be a single moment that changes the direction of a person's life. An interview, a meeting, a decision, an opportunity. The preparation leads to a moment that becomes a turning point. There is a proverb that says, a man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men. Now look at Esther's journey. She did not force her way into the palace. She did not fight for attention. She did not try to outshine others. Yet, she ends up standing before the king. Esther didn't chase position. Her elevation was not driven by striving. She was taken into the palace system, prepared quietly, guided with wisdom, positioned over time. She didn't push herself forward. She allowed the process to unfold. Her gift was her character. Esther's favor came from something deeper than appearance. Scripture repeatedly says she found favor. That favor came from humility, discernment, wisdom, the ability to listen. She followed Mordecai's guidance, knowing when to speak and when to be silent. These are inner qualities, not external striving. By the time we reach the 10th month, something has happened. Her preparation is complete. Now she is brought before the king, not because she demanded it, but because the process has made room for her. This connects directly with Ruth. In the story of Ruth, Ruth goes into the field. Esther enters preparation. Ruth is noticed by Boaz. Esther finds favor. Ruth is brought into redemption. Esther is brought before the king. Neither of them forced the outcome. Their alignment and character created the opportunity. Modern relatable example. This is something we see in real life too. Someone works quietly with excellence. Someone consistently shows integrity. Someone develops skill and character. Then one day, they are recommended. They are promoted. They are called into a room they didn't fight to enter. It looks sudden, but their gift made room for them. Esther shows us something powerful. Position is not always achieved by force. Sometimes it is revealed when preparation is complete. Your gift does not need to fight for space. When it is fully formed, it naturally creates space for itself. Sometimes we feel like we have to force doors open. But these stories remind us of something deeper. What is truly aligned does not have to struggle for recognition. When the time is right, when the preparation is complete, when the character has been formed, the door opens and you find yourself standing in places you never had to fight to enter. Esther 2:17. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight. Again, favor. The king favors Esther above all the other women. He places the royal crown on her head. Esther becomes queen in place of Vashti. The vacancy created in chapter 1 is now filled. The woman who began the story as an orphan, unknown, living quietly in exile, now occupies the highest position in the empire. This is one of the major reversals in the narrative. Modern relatable example. This moment reflects how unexpected individuals sometimes rise into positions of influence. Many people who later become leaders or change systems once appeared ordinary. Their journey often begins quietly, before the moment when their role becomes visible. Esther entered the palace without knowing the role she would eventually play. She simply moved through the opportunities placed before her with humility and wisdom. The story quietly reminds us that sometimes people are placed in environments long before they understand why. Only later do they realize that those earlier moments were preparing them for something much larger. Esther 2:18. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's feast. After Esther becomes queen, the king celebrates with a grand feast in her honor. He also gives gifts and grants relief to the provinces. The palace that removed Vashti now celebrates Esther. This continues the theme of reversal that runs through the entire book. What began with conflict now shifts to celebration. Modern relatable example. This resembles moments when someone rises into a new role and the organization celebrates the appointment. Inauguration ceremonies, leadership celebrations, company announcement of a new CEO, public celebration marks a new chapter. Esther 2:19. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai sat at the king's gate. Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. In ancient cities, the gate was the place of authority and governance. People who sat at the gate often participated in legal or administrative matters. So, Mordecai is positioned close to the center of decision making. This is similar to someone working near the center of power today. Government offices, corporate headquarters, leadership teams. Being in those environments means witnessing important events. Esther 2:20. Esther still had not revealed her family or her people. Esther continues to keep her Jewish identity hidden, just as Mordecai instructed. The theme of hidden identity continues. Esther now holds the highest position in the palace, yet the king does not know her background. The story is building toward a moment when that hidden identity will matter greatly. Modern relatable example. Many people navigate environments where parts of their identity remain unseen or undisclosed until the right moment. Sometimes, timing determines when something important is revealed. Esther 2:21. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, two of the king's officers became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Mordecai overhears a plot by two royal officials planning to assassinate the king. The narrative introduces a moment of hidden loyalty. Mordecai protects the king, even though he is not rewarded immediately. This event, will become crucial later in the story. Modern parallel. Sometimes people do the right thing even when no recognition follows. For example, whistleblowing against wrongdoing, reporting security risk, protecting an organization quietly. The impact of those actions may not be seen immediately. Esther 2:22. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. Mordecai informs Esther about the assassination plot. Esther reports the information to the king and credits Mordecai. This moment shows the connection between Mordecai and Esther working quietly behind the scenes. Their relationship becomes a channel through which important information flows. Esther 2:23. And when the affair was investigated, it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles. The plot is investigated and confirmed. The conspirators are punished. Mordecai's action is written in the royal records, but he receives no reward. This verse plants a narrative seed. The act is recorded, but forgotten. Later in the story, the king will rediscover this record, and that forgotten moment will change everything. The author is showing how events that seem insignificant can become pivotal later. Modern relatable example. Many acts of integrity or diligence go unnoticed at first. But sometimes, those same actions become important later. A reference from a former supervisor. A past contribution remembered at the right time. A good reputation that later opens doors. The story reminds us that not every meaningful action receives immediate recognition. Chapter 2 reveals something profound about timing. Some events in life appear small when they happen, but later, those same moments become the turning points of the story. The narrative of Esther reminds us that preparation, hidden identity, and unnoticed acts of loyalty may all be shaping a future moment we cannot yet see. Moving on to chapter 3. Esther 3:1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman and set his throne above all the officials. Haman is elevated to the highest political position in the empire under the king. He becomes the most powerful official in the government. The narrative introduces the antagonist. The story often shows how power can elevate individuals whose character has not yet been tested. This sets the stage for the conflict. Modern parallel. This is relatable in many environments. Sometimes, individuals rise quickly in organizations, corporate leadership, government positions, institutional authority, but the true character of leadership often becomes visible only when power is exercised. Esther 3:2. All the king's servants bowed down and paid homage to Haman, but Mordecai did not bow. The king's officials bowed to Haman as a sign of respect and submission, but Mordecai refuses to bow. Just like Vashti's refusal earlier in the story, this moment introduces another act of defiance against authority. This single refusal becomes the spark that ignites the conflict. More relatable example. We see similar situations today when individuals refuse to participate in practices they believe compromise their integrity. Examples include refusing unethical instructions at work, refusing to participate in corrupt systems, standing by personal convictions despite pressure. Often, one small act of refusal can trigger large reactions within institutions. Esther 3:3. Why do you transgress the king's command? The other officials question Mordecai. They want to know why he refuses to follow the rule. Structural insight. When someone challenges the norm, others often pressure them to conform. This shows how systems enforce compliance through social pressure. Modern parallel. This happens frequently in workplaces or communities. Why are you doing things differently? Why can't you just follow the rules like everyone else? The pressure to conform can be strong. Esther 3:4. They spoke to him day after day. The officials repeatedly questioned Mordecai. Eventually, they report the situation to Haman. Persistent pressure is applied until the situation is escalated. The issue moves from a personal refusal to a political problem. Modern parallel. Sometimes, when someone refuses to conform, the situation escalates. Supervisors become involved. Leadership intervenes. Disciplinary actions may follow. What began as a personal decision becomes an institutional issue. Esther 3:5. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow, he was filled with wrath. Haman becomes furious when he sees Mordecai refusing to bow. This verse reveals Haman's character. His reaction is driven by pride and ego. Instead of ignoring one man's refusal, he becomes consumed by anger. More relatable example. Sometimes, individuals in positions of power take disagreement personally. Rather than viewing it as a difference of opinion, they interpret it as disrespect. This can trigger disproportionate reactions. Esther 3:6. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He sought to destroy all the Jews. Haman decides not only to punish Mordecai, instead, he plans to destroy all Jewish people throughout the empire. This reveals how personal offense can escalate into widespread harm. A single individual's refusal becomes the justification for targeting an entire group. History contains many examples where leaders use personal grievances to justify collective punishment. Sometimes, conflicts that begin with individuals expand into broader hostility toward entire communities. Chapter 3 shows how quickly power and pride can turn personal offense into destructive decisions. Haman's anger did not begin with an entire nation. It began with one man refusing to bow. The story invites readers to reflect on how ego and wounded pride can distort judgment and lead to harmful actions. This verse reveals a powerful psychological pattern. A personal conflict becomes generalized to an entire group. Haman moves from Mordecai offended me to his entire people must be destroyed. The narrative exposes how ego and wounded pride can distort perception. Instead of addressing the individual situation, the anger spreads outward. Modern relatable examples. We often see this dynamic on social media and in everyday conversations. For example, a man hurt in a relationship begins saying, "All women are the same." A woman hurt in a relationship says, "All men are toxic." One negative experience leads to generalizations about an entire race or culture. Stereotypes form from isolated incidents. The pattern becomes one experience to sweeping generalization. This is exactly what Haman is doing. Social and cultural implications. History shows how dangerous this mindset can be. Many large-scale conflicts began with stereotyping and collective blame. When people begin thinking in terms of all of them, it becomes easier to justify harmful actions. The book of Esther reveals this pattern clearly. Haman's anger toward one individual becomes hostility toward an entire people. Esther 3:6 invites us to examine how easily human beings fall into the trap of generalization. When someone hurts us, the temptation is often to expand that experience and project it onto others. But wisdom requires recognizing the difference between individual behavior and entire groups of people. The story quietly shows how dangerous it can become when wounded pride turns into collective Esther 3:7. In the first month, they cast pur from day to day, and from month to month, to the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. We see 12 again. The number 12 often represents government, order, structure, a complete system being established. We see this pattern throughout scripture. 12 tribes of Israel, structure of a nation. 12 apostles, foundation of a new movement. 12 gates in Revelation, complete order. So, 12 is not just a number. It represents a system reaching full structure or authority. What is happening in Esther 3:7? Haman is casting lots pur to determine when to execute his plan against the Jews, and the lot falls to the 12th month. This is very important because it shows the plan is being set within a full system of order and timing. The decision is not random, it is structured. The hidden irony. Here's where it becomes powerful. Haman thinks he is establishing control, setting a fixed outcome, creating a final plan. But the story will later show the very system he set up will be overturned. The deeper message in Esther. Esther is showing something very profound. Even when systems of power appear fully established, even when decisions seem finalized, even when timing looks fixed, they are not beyond reversal. This is very relatable today. Sometimes policies are passed, decisions are finalized, systems are put in place, and it feels like this is permanent. Nothing can change this. But Esther shows what looks final can still be overturned. What looks structured can still be disrupted. The 12th month represents a system reaching its full form. But the story of Esther shows us even a fully established system can be reversed when truth and courage enter the scene. What casting lots represents. In the ancient world, casting lots was a way of seeking certainty, controlling outcomes, determining timing. It was essentially saying, let me fix the future. Let me decide the exact moment. Haman believes he is setting the timeline, controlling the outcome, finalizing a system. From his perspective, everything is now structured, scheduled, inevitable. But this is where the story becomes powerful. While Haman is casting lots, something else is already unfolding. Esther has already been positioned. Favor has already been established. Relationships are already in place. So, while Haman is trying to control the future, the story shows that something deeper is already in motion. The hidden pattern. This creates a powerful contrast. Haman is trying to control timing. Esther is walking through preparation. Haman is casting lots. Esther is finding favor. Haman is building a system. Esther is being positioned quietly. Haman is operating from control. Esther is operating through alignment and timing. The great reversal. What Haman intended for destruction becomes the very timing of his downfall. The date he chose, thinking it was his advantage, becomes part of the story of reversal. This is why the feast is later called Purim, named after the very lots he cast. Modern relatable example. We see this today. People try to control every outcome, force opportunities, manipulate timing, plan everything rigidly. But life often shows things don't unfold by force. The right moment cannot be rushed. What is aligned unfolds at the right time. The powerful message in Esther 3. Even when someone thinks they have set the timeline, secured the outcome, finalized the system, the story shows there is still room for reversal. Sometimes it feels like everything has already been decided, like the outcome is fixed, like the system is too strong to change. But Esther reminds us of something powerful. What is aligned does not need to fight for control. Because even when plans are made in secret, even when decisions are finalized, even when timing is set, there is still a deeper unfolding taking place. And when the moment comes, everything can change. Esther 3:8. There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples. Haman approaches the king and begins presenting his argument. He describes the Jewish people as a group living throughout the empire. He claims they have different customs and do not follow the king's laws. Notice how Haman frames the situation. He does not mention Mordecai or his personal anger. Instead, he describes the group as a problem for the empire. This is a classic political strategy. He turns a personal grievance into a national issue. Modern relatable example. We often see similar patterns when leaders frame issues in ways that create fear or division. Instead of acknowledging personal motives, the argument becomes, this group threatens our system. These people are different from everyone else. Their presence is a problem for society. This kind of framing can shape how others perceive the situation. Esther 3:9. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. Haman asked the king to authorize a decree to destroy the Jewish people. He even offers to pay a large sum of money into the royal treasury. Haman is not only appealing to authority, but also to financial incentives. This shows how power, politics, and economics often intersect. The proposal becomes easier for the king to accept because it appears beneficial to the empire. Modern parallel. In many systems, decisions are influenced by multiple factors: political influence, financial benefits, persuasion by advisors. Proposals that appear advantageous to leaders often gain quick approval. Esther 3:10. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. The king gives Haman his ring. This ring represents the authority to issue official decrees in the king's name. This moment transfers immense power to Haman. With the ring, Haman can issue commands that carry the authority of the king. The narrative shows how quickly power can be delegated. Modern parallel. This is similar to situations where leaders grant authority to trusted officials or executives. For example, a CEO empowering a senior executive, a president delegating authority to advisors, a leader allowing someone else to implement major decisions. Delegated power can have significant consequences. Esther 3:11. The king said to Haman, "The money is given to you. The people also do with them as it seems good to you." The king agrees to Haman's proposal. He gives Haman permission to proceed. This verse highlights the danger of unchecked authority combined with personal motives. The king approves the plan without deeply examining it. This decision sets the central conflict of the story into motion. Modern parallel. Throughout history, decisions made by leaders based on incomplete information or persuasive advices have sometimes led to serious consequences. This moment reminds us of the importance of careful judgment and accountability in positions of power. Chapter 3 shows how personal pride, when combined with political influence, can create situations that affect many people. What began as a single act of refusal has now become a decree that threatens an entire nation. The story invites readers to reflect on how important humility, wisdom, and careful leadership are when decisions carry wide-reaching consequences. Esther 3:12. Then the king's scribes were summoned, and an edict was written according to all that Haman commanded. The king's scribes are called. They begin writing the official decree. The order is written in every language and sent to every province in the empire. It carries the authority of the king's seal. This moment shows how decisions become institutionalized. Once something is written into official law, It moves beyond personal opinion. It becomes policy. The narrative highlights how systems implement decisions through administration and communication. This resembles how major decisions become official today. Laws passed by governments, corporate policies written and distributed, institutional directives sent to all departments. Once something becomes official policy, it affects everyone within the system. Esther 3:13. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews. Messengers delivered the decree across the empire. The decree commands that the Jewish people be destroyed on a specific day. Their property may also be taken. This verse shows how bureaucratic systems can implement harmful decisions. The order is delivered systematically across provinces. No personal relationships exist between the people sending the letters and the people affected by them. The system simply carries out the command. More relatable example. Throughout history, many large-scale decisions have been carried out through systems of administration. Policies issued from central leadership can affect millions of people who had no involvement in the original decision. This verse reveals how powerful administrative structures can be. Esther 3:14. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province. The decree is publicly announced throughout the empire. People are informed of what will happen. The announcement creates anticipation and tension. The date of destruction is set months in advance. The narrative now places the Jewish community under the shadow of this future event. Modern parallel. Sometimes, societies experience similar moments when announcements create widespread concern. Economic crisis, political decisions affecting large populations, policies that create uncertainty about the future. Public announcements can dramatically affect how people feel and respond. Esther 3:15. The couriers went out hurriedly, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. The decree spreads rapidly. While the king and Haman sit down to drink, the city becomes confused and disturbed by the news. This verse creates a striking contrast. At the center of power, the leaders appear calm, but the people affected by the decision experience confusion and fear. The narrative reveals the disconnect that can exist between leadership and the population. More relatable example. We sometimes see similar dynamics today. Major decisions may be made by leaders who are removed from the daily experiences of the people affected. While decision makers may appear calm, communities impacted by those decisions can experience anxiety and uncertainty. Chapter 3 reveals how quickly personal pride can escalate into decisions that affect entire communities. A conflict that began with one individual refusing to bow has now become a decree that threatens an entire people. The story now moves toward the moment when Esther must decide whether she'll remain silent or step forward, and that decision will lead to one of the most famous lines in the entire narrative. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai hears about the decree that threatens the Jewish people. He responds with deep grief. He tears his clothes and mourns publicly. In ancient cultures, tearing clothes and wearing sackcloth symbolize mourning and distress. This shows the seriousness of the situation. The crisis is now deeply personal. Modern relatable example. When communities face serious threats or tragedies, people often express grief publicly. Examples include protests, vigils, public demonstrations, community gatherings in times of crisis. Public expression communicates that something deeply important is at stake. Esther 4:2. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate. Mordecai approaches the gate of the palace. However, those wearing mourning garments are not allowed inside the palace. This moment highlights the contrast between the palace and the suffering outside it. The palace maintains an image of order and beauty, while outside, people are grieving. Modern parallel. Sometimes, institutions attempt to maintain stability and appearance, even when people outside the center of power are struggling. This contrast between leadership environment and the realities of ordinary people appears throughout history. Esther 4:3. In every province, there was great mourning among the Jews. Across the empire, Jewish communities begin mourning. They fast, weep, and lament because of the decree. The crisis spreads across the entire empire. What began as a decision in the palace now affects communities everywhere. Modern parallel. Large-scale decisions can impact people across entire regions. Examples include national policies, economic decisions, conflicts affecting multiple communities. The ripple effects of leadership decisions can reach far beyond where they were originally made. Esther 4:4. When Esther's young women and the eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. Esther learns about Mordecai's mourning. She sends clothing for him so he can remove the sackcloth, but he refuses. Esther initially tries to resolve the situation at a surface level. She attempts to remove the visible sign of mourning rather than addressing the deeper issue. Modern parallel. Sometimes, when people see distress, the first reaction is to try to make the situation appear better rather than understanding the underlying problem. This verse shows Esther beginning to realize that something serious is happening. Esther 4 verse 5 to 7. Esther sends a messenger named Hattach to learn what is happening. Mordecai explains the entire situation and gives the messenger a copy of the decree. Information begins to flow between Mordecai and Esther. Communication becomes essential for understanding the crisis. Modern parallel. In times of crisis, accurate information is crucial. Leaders often rely on trusted intermediaries to understand events happening outside their immediate environment. Esther 4:8. Mordecai instructs Esther to go before the king and plead for her people. This is the moment where Esther's position becomes meaningful. Her placement in the palace now carries responsibility. The story moves from preparation to decision. Esther 4 verse 9 to 11. Esther responds with hesitation. Approaching the king without being summoned could result in death. The king has not called her for 30 days. Esther's hesitation reflects a real danger. Her decision is not symbolic. It involves genuine risk. The narrative emphasizes the cost of stepping forward. Sometimes, people find themselves in positions where speaking up could involve serious consequences. Challenging powerful leaders, exposing injustice, advocating for vulnerable communities. Courage often involves real risk. Esther 4 verse 12 to 14. Mordecai responds with the most famous words in the story. Do not think that you will escape. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This is the central turning point of the entire narrative. Mordecai reframes Esther's position. Her role is not simply personal success. Her position exists within a larger story. Modern relatable insight. Many people discover that positions they hold in life carry responsibilities beyond personal benefit. Sometimes, individuals realize they are uniquely placed to influence situations that affect others. This verse reflects the moment when someone recognizes the significance of their position. Esther 4 verse 15 to 16. Esther responds with courage. She asks Mordecai to gather the Jewish people to fast for 3 days. Then she declares, I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. Esther moves from hesitation to decision. The story now shifts from fear to courage. Modern parallel. Throughout history, individuals have stepped forward in moments of crisis despite uncertainty. These moments often become defining points in both personal and collective stories. Esther 4:17. Mordecai carries out Esther's instructions. The story now moves toward the moment when Esther will approach the king. Chapter 4 reveals the moment when preparation meets purpose. Esther did not enter the palace knowing this moment would come. But when the crisis arrived, she realized that her position carried responsibility. The story invites readers to reflect on moments when they may be called to step forward despite uncertainty. Sometimes, the positions people hold in life become meaningful precisely because of the moments they are willing to act. Esther 4:16. Go, gather all the Jews and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, or for 3 days, night or day. Esther asked Mordecai to gather the Jewish people. She instructs them to fast for 3 days. She and her attendants will also fast. And after those 3 days, she will approach the king, even though it could cost her life. Fasting in scripture often represents a pause before decisive action. It is a moment when normal activity stops. People step away from routine and enter a period of focus, reflection, and preparation. In Esther's case, the fast occurs right before the most important decision of her life. So, the fast marks the transition between hesitation, courage, and action. In modern life, fasting does not always have to be only about food. People often fast from things that create noise in their lives. Examples include stepping away from social media, turning off constant news or notifications, taking time away from busy schedules, spending quiet time reflecting before making a major decision. Sometimes, the clearest decisions come when we temporarily remove distractions. In biblical narratives, 3 often marks a completed transition or turning point. Examples include Jonah emerging after 3 days, Jesus rising on the 3rd day, Peter's restoration after 3 denials, Jesus praying 3 times before his arrest. The pattern often represents movement from one state into another. In Esther's story, the 3-day fast marks the moment when she moves from fear to courage, from uncertainty to decision, from hidden identity to stepping forward. After the fast, Esther will approach the king, and that action will begin the reversal of the entire situation. This moment reminds us that important decisions often benefit from quiet reflection. Before stepping into moments that carry great weight, people sometimes need time to pause, gather themselves, and gain clarity. The 3-day fast in Esther marks the moment where preparation gives way to courageous action. Let's look at do not eat or drink for 3 days. Esther asked the Jewish community to fast for 3 days before she approaches the king. Fasting here expresses seriousness, dependence, and preparation before a risky action. Eating and drinking represents internalizing something. If eating and drinking represents internalizing something, then temporarily refraining from them can symbolize not absorbing the surrounding fear, noise, or pressure. This situation could be compared to moments when leaders ask people to step back from chaos so a solution can be pursued. For example, someone might say, "Stop the protests for a moment. Stop the debates. Let me go into the room and see what I can do." The pause does not mean the issue disappears. It simply creates the space needed for focused action. What Esther is doing? Esther understands that the situation requires strategy and timing. If the environment remains filled with panic and noise, it becomes harder to act wisely. So she calls for a pause. This moment of stillness prepares the way for her to approach the king. The shift in the story. Before Esther 4:16, the people are overwhelmed by the decree. After Esther 4:16, the story moves toward intentional action. The fast marks the turning point, where the community moves from panic to preparation, from confusion to strategy, from fear to courage. This moment in the story shows that when crises arise, sometimes the first step is not immediate reaction, but thoughtful preparation. Creating space to reflect and plan can help transform a chaotic situation into one where meaningful action becomes possible. Sometimes, people need to stop constantly consuming information or emotions that overwhelm them. Examples might include stepping away from social media arguments, pausing news consumption during stressful events, taking time away from constant opinions and pressure. This pause allows people to reset internally before making important decisions. Seen this way, Esther 4:16 can symbolize a moment where a community stopped internalizing fear and instead centers itself before stepping into a decisive moment. The story shows that before major action, there can be value in stepping back, quieting the noise, and allowing clarity to emerge. Esther 5:1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. After the 3-day fast, Esther dresses in her royal robes and approaches the king's court. This is dangerous because approaching the king without being summoned could lead to death. But when the king sees her, he extends the golden scepter, a sign that she is welcomed. This moment represents the crossing from preparation into action. Notice the sequence: 3 days of fasting, Esther putting on royal garments, Esther entering the court. The garments symbolize stepping into her role. She moves from private preparation to public responsibility. More relatable example: sometimes people prepare quietly before stepping into an important moment. Examples include preparing before an important presentation, rehearsing before a major speech, gathering courage before confronting an issue. There is often a moment where preparation ends and action begins. Esther 5:2-3. What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you. The king welcomes Esther and asks what she wants. He even offers up to half the kingdom. The king's generosity shows Esther now has influence. But instead of immediately revealing the problem, Esther does something surprising. Esther 5:4. If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet. Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. She does not reveal her request yet. Esther is strategic and patient. Instead of confronting the situation immediately, she creates an environment where the conversation can unfold carefully. Timing becomes part of the strategy. Modern parallel. Sometimes, when dealing with sensitive situations, people choose the right setting before addressing the issue. Examples include inviting someone to a meeting before discussing a conflict, preparing the right environment before raising a difficult topic, building rapport before presenting a major concern. Timing can influence outcomes. Esther 5 verse 5 to 6. At the banquet, the king again asks Esther what she wants. Again, she delays the request. Esther 5 7 to 8. Let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare. Esther invites them to another banquet the next day. She still does not reveal her request. Esther's patience allows events to unfold. This delay will create the circumstances that eventually expose Haman. Sometimes, waiting creates opportunities that immediate action would miss. Esther 5:9. Haman leaves the banquet feeling honored. But when he sees Mordecai refusing to bow, he becomes angry again. This verse shows Haman's pride. His joy disappears because one person does not honor him. It reveals how fragile ego can be. Esther 5 verse 10 to 11. Haman gathers his friends and boasts about his wealth, his sons, his promotion, his closeness to the king and queen. Haman's speech reveals how deeply his identity is tied to status and recognition. His sense of worth depends on how others treat him. Esther 5 verse 12 to 13. Haman says something revealing. Even though he has all these privileges, he says, all this is worth nothing to me, as long as I see Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. One person's refusal overshadows all of Haman's success. This shows how ego can magnify small offenses into overwhelming frustrations. Esther 5:14. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Haman returns home angry because Mordecai refuses to bow to him. He tells his wife Zeresh and his friends about the situation. Instead of calming him or encouraging wisdom, they suggest something extreme. Build a gallows and ask the king to execute Mordecai. Haman likes the idea and begins preparing it. This verse reveals something important about influence. Haman's anger already exists, but the people closest to him reinforce and amplify that anger. Instead of guiding him toward restraint or wisdom, they push him further toward destructive action. The story quietly shows how the voices around us can shape our decisions. Modern relatable examples. People are often influenced by the perspectives of those closest to them. For example, friends encouraging someone to retaliate in a conflict. People in social circles reinforcing anger instead of encouraging reconciliation. Individuals receiving advice that intensifies emotions rather than calming them. Sometimes, the people around us can either help us gain clarity or deepen our frustration. Esther 6:1. That night, the king could not sleep. On the same night Haman plans to ask the king to execute Mordecai, the king cannot sleep. He orders the royal chronicles to be read to him. This small detail becomes the turning point of the story. The king's sleepless nights lead to the discovery of a forgotten event. Mordecai once saved his life. A seemingly ordinary moment changes the course of the entire narrative. Sometimes, small or unexpected moments can lead to important discoveries. People may revisit past records, conversations, or memories that suddenly reveal something significant. What seemed insignificant earlier can become crucial later. Esther 6:2. It was found that Mordecai had told about the plot. The records reveal that Mordecai once exposed an assassination plot against the king. This is the event recorded in Esther 2, verse 21 to 23. At the time, Mordecai received no reward. But the story now circles back to that moment. The narrative shows how actions that seem forgotten can later resurface. Modern parallel. Sometimes, good actions go unnoticed at first. Later, those same actions may become important when people review past contributions or records. Reputation and integrity can carry long-term impact. Esther 6:3. What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai? The king realizes Mordecai was never rewarded. The king now wants to correct that oversight. This moment begins the reversal that will soon unfold. Esther 6, verse 4 to 5. Haman arrives early in the morning to ask permission to execute Mordecai. But before he can speak, the king asks him a question. This is where the irony of the story begins. Haman enters the palace, intending to destroy Mordecai. Instead, he will soon be asked how to honor him. Esther 6:6. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? The king asked Haman how someone should be honored. Haman assumes the king is referring to him. Haman's pride blinds him. He cannot imagine the king honoring anyone else. His assumption reveals how deeply ego can shape perception. Sometimes, people assume situations revolve around them because of status or pride. This can lead to misunderstandings about intentions or outcomes. Esther 6 verse 7 to 9. Haman suggests an elaborate public honor, royal robes, the king's horse, a public parade through the city. Ironically, Haman designs the ceremony that would soon honor the very person he hates. Esther 6:10. Hurry and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. The king tells Haman to carry out the ceremony for Mordecai. This is the great reversal. The man who planned Mordecai's execution must now honor him publicly. Modern parallel. Sometimes, situations unfold in ways that expose hidden intentions or reverse expectations. Moments of irony can reveal deeper lessons about pride and humility. Esther 6:11. Haman leads Mordecai through the city proclaiming his honor. The humiliation of Haman contrasts sharply with his earlier boasting. The narrative shows how quickly pride can collapse. Esther 6:12. Mordecai returns quietly to his position at the king's gate. Haman returns home distressed. Mordecai does not boast or celebrate publicly. He simply returns to his place. His humility contrasts with Haman's pride. Esther 6:13. Haman tells his wife and friends what happened. They warn him that Mordecai's rise signals his own downfall. Notice the change. The same voices that encouraged Haman earlier now predict disaster. The influence of surrounding voices appears again. Esther 6:14. While they were still talking, the king's servants arrived to bring Haman to Esther's banquet. The narrative moves quickly now. Events are accelerating toward the final confrontation. Chapter 6 reveals the fragile nature of pride. Haman believed he controlled the situation. But the story shows how quickly circumstances can change. The very honor he imagined for himself becomes the honor he must give to the man he despises. The narrative reminds readers that humility and integrity often endure longer than pride and power. Esther 7 verse 1 to 2. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. The king and Haman attend Esther's second banquet. Again, the king asks Esther what she desires. He repeats his earlier promise to grant her request. The scene is carefully staged. Esther has created the right environment and timing for her request. The tension that has been building throughout the story now reaches its peak. Modern relatable example. Sometimes, important conversations require the right moment. People may prepare carefully before addressing a serious issue, choosing the right time and setting to speak. Esther 7 verse 3 to 4. If I have found favor, let my life be granted to me and my people. Esther finally reveals her request. She asked the king to spare her life and the lives of her people. She explains that they have been condemned to destruction. This is the moment when Esther reveals her hidden identity. Earlier in the story, her Jewish identity was concealed. Now, it becomes central to the crisis. The hidden truth is finally spoken. Modern parallel. There are moments in life when people must reveal truths that were previously hidden in order to address injustice or danger. Speaking openly can become a turning point. Esther 7:5. Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? The king becomes alarmed and demands to know who planned this. The king is now realizing that the decree he approved affects his own queen. The situation suddenly becomes personal. Esther 7:6. The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Esther identifies Haman as the one responsible. Haman becomes terrified. The antagonist is finally exposed. Everything Haman attempted to hide now comes into the open. Modern parallel. Moments like this occur when hidden motives or harmful actions are finally revealed. Truth can dramatically shift how situations are perceived. Esther 7:7. The king realizes the consequence. The king arose in his wrath from the banquet. When Esther reveals that her people are about to be destroyed, the king suddenly realizes something. The decree he previously approved, based on Haman's persuasion, will harm his own queen. The situation becomes personal. The king reacts with anger and leaves the room to process what he has just heard. This moment shows how sometimes leaders approve decisions without fully understanding the consequences. When the reality becomes clear, they suddenly see the situation differently. The narrative exposes how policies can be created based on incomplete information or manipulation. How perspective changes. Earlier, the decree was abstract. It was about a certain people scattered throughout the empire. Now, the king realizes the decree affects Esther herself. The shift from abstract to personal changes everything. This moment shows how decisions can feel distant when leaders do not see the people affected by them. But when the human impact becomes visible, perspectives often change. The story reminds readers that policies and decisions are never just ideas on paper. They always affect real people. Esther 7 verse 8 to 10. After Esther exposes Haman's plot, The king returns to the banquet room. Haman falls near Esther while pleading for his life. The king interprets this as inappropriate behavior toward the queen. At that moment, one of the king's officials mentions that Haman had built gallows intended for Mordecai. The king orders Haman to be executed on those same gallows. The threat is removed. This moment represents the removal of the obstacle that created the crisis. Throughout the story, Haman has been the driving force behind the destructive decree. Once his intentions are exposed, the system removes him from power. The narrative shows how exposing the source of a harmful plan can lead to its collapse. Modern relatable example. Imagine a company where a harmful policy was created by a powerful executive. The consequences of that policy become clear. Leadership realizes the damage it could cause. The response might involve reversing the policy, removing the executive responsible, restructuring leadership. The goal becomes restoring stability by eliminating the source of the problem. The irony in the story. There is also a powerful irony here. Haman built the gallows, expecting Mordecai to be executed. Instead, the very structure he prepared becomes the instrument of his own downfall. The story highlights how destructive intentions can sometimes turn back on the person who initiated them. There's a proverb that says, "He who digs a pit will fall into it." Now look at Haman. He literally builds the gallows, sets a plan for Mordecai, fixes a date for destruction, creates a system to eliminate others. Everything is intentional. Everything is structured. Everything looks certain. But what happens? The very gallows Haman built becomes the instrument of his own downfall. The plan he designed for another returns to him. Actions carry consequences that often return to the source. Not always immediately, but often in a way that mirrors the original intent. We still see this pattern today. Someone sets a trap for another, ends up exposed. Someone spreads harm, reputation collapses. Someone builds a system of injustice, system eventually fails. It may take time, but the pattern is consistent. Esther is showing us you cannot build destruction outwardly without it eventually turning inward. Haman thought he was digging a pit for someone else, but he was actually shaping his own outcome. Sometimes, people think they are getting away with things, that they are in control, that the outcome is fixed in their favor. But Esther reveals something quietly powerful. What is built in misalignment carries its own undoing within it. So, the question is not just what we are building, but from what place we are building it. Because whatever we set in motion has a way of returning. Paul writes, "Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap." This is not just a rule about behavior. It is a pattern of alignment. Look at the contrast. Haman sows pride, sows manipulation, sows distraction, reaps downfall. Esther walks in humility, moves with wisdom, acts with discernment, reaps favor and elevation. Ruth carries the same pattern. You live in misalignment, you reap the same. You live in humility, you reap the reward. This is not about punishment. It is about what naturally flows from what is planted. We see this clearly in life. Someone consistently dishonest, trust breaks down. Someone consistent and reliable, opportunities increase. Someone operating from ego, relationships suffer. Someone operating from humility, doors open. Is the same principle playing out. The seed always carries the nature of what it will produce. You cannot plant pride and expect peace. You cannot plant deception and expect stability. You cannot plant harm and expect wholeness. And in the same way, you cannot plant integrity and not see trust grow. You cannot plant humility and not see favor appear. You cannot plant truth and not see alignment unfold. So, the question is not just what we want to receive, but what we are consistently sowing, because in time, the harvest reveals the seed. Esther 8:1. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman. After Haman's downfall, his property and estate are given to Esther. Mordecai is brought before the king because Esther reveals their relationship. The reversal continues. The wealth and power that once belonged to Haman are now transferred to Esther and Mordecai. What belonged to the oppressor now becomes the possession of those he intended to destroy. This is similar to situations where leadership changes after wrongdoing is exposed. When someone is removed from power, their authority and responsibilities are often reassigned to someone more trustworthy. Esther 8:2. The king took off his ring and gave it to Mordecai. The ring that once gave Haman authority is now given to Mordecai. The ring represents the power to issue royal decrees. The authority of the empire shifts. The same power that once threatened the Jewish people now belongs to someone who protects them. Modern parallel. This resembles a leadership transition. For example, a company executive removed from misconduct, a trusted employee promoted into the position, authority transferred to someone with integrity. Esther 8:3. Esther again spoke to the king. Esther pleads with the king to stop the decree that ordered the destruction of her people. She weeps and asks for help. Even though Haman is gone, the decree he created still exists. This shows how systems and policies can continue affecting people, even after the person who created them is removed. More relatable example. This happens often in institutions. Even after leadership changes, previous policies may still remain in effect. New leadership must work to correct those policies. Esther 8 verse 4-5. The king extends the golden scepter again. Esther asks the king to revoke the decree written by Haman. Esther is now fully using her position to advocate for her people. Her earlier preparation and courage now become meaningful. Esther 8:6. How can I bear to see the disaster that will come to my people? Esther speaks not only as queen, but as someone personally connected to those affected. Her identity is no longer hidden. She stands openly for her people. Esther 8, verse 7 to 8. The king allows Esther and Mordecai to write a new decree in his name. However, the previous decree cannot technically be revoked. Instead, a new decree will counteract it. This reveals something important about legal systems. Sometimes, harmful policies cannot simply be erased. Instead, new laws must be introduced to counter them. Esther 8, verse 9 to 10. Scribes write the new decree and send it across the empire. It is translated into every language. Just like the earlier decree spread danger across the empire, the new decree spreads protection. The same system that carried harm now carries restoration. Esther 8, verse 11 to 12. The decree allows Jewish people to defend themselves against anyone who attacks them. The story moves from vulnerability to empowerment. Those who were targeted are now given the ability to protect themselves. Esther 8:15. Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes. Mordecai leaves the palace wearing royal garments. The city of Susa rejoices. The man who once sat quietly at the gate now walks in royal authority. Another reversal is complete. Esther 8:16 to 17. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. The people celebrate because the decree has changed their future. The story moves from mourning in chapter 4 to celebration in chapter 8. What began as despair now becomes hope. Chapter 8 shows that exposing injustice is only part of the process. After the truth comes out, systems must still work to repair the damage that was done. Esther's courage and Mordecai's rise create the opportunity for restoration. The narrative reminds readers that leadership can be used either to harm or to protect. And when placed in the right hands, authority can become a force for restoration. This echoes the proverb that says, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked rule, the people groan." Now look at the structure of Esther. The book shows two phases of authority. Earlier, Haman, fear, oppression, decree of destruction. Later, Esther and Mordecai, relief, protection, celebration. When Haman rises to power, policies are written that threaten lives. Fear spreads across the land. People are in distress. This reflects exactly what the proverb says. When misaligned leadership is in power, people suffer. When Esther and Mordecai step into influence, the decree is counted, protection is established, the people rejoice. The atmosphere shifts completely. This is one of the central messages of Esther. Authority shapes atmosphere. The same system, the same kingdom, but a different influence produces a completely different outcome. It's not just about power. It's about the state of the one holding the power. When the state is pride, ego, control, it leads to oppression. When the state is humility, wisdom, alignment, it leads to restoration. We still see this pattern today in leadership, in workplaces, in families, in institutions. The person in authority influences the culture, the decisions, the outcomes. Power does not create character, it reveals it. And whatever is within a person eventually flows into the environment around them. So, when misalignment sits in authority, the people feel it. But when wisdom, humility, and truth rise into position, everything begins to shift. Because authority is not just a position, it is a channel. And whatever flows through it touches everyone connected to it. Esther 8:17. In every province and in every city, there was joy and gladness among the Jews. And many of the peoples of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. After the new decree allowing the Jewish people to defend themselves spreads across the empire, the atmosphere changes dramatically. What began as mourning and fear now becomes celebration and relief. The text also says many people in the land identified with the Jews. Seen symbolically, this moment reflects a shift where people begin aligning themselves with what is now recognized as right and protected. Earlier in the story, the empire was moving under the influence of Haman's manipulation. Now that the truth has been revealed and authority has shifted, people begin adjusting their alignment. The narrative shows how when truth becomes clear and power structures change, many people move toward what is now recognized as the rightful position. In many situations, we see similar patterns. When deception or injustice is exposed, people often begin distancing themselves from the harmful position and aligning with what is now recognized as correct. Examples include employees supporting ethical leadership after corruption is revealed, communities changing perspectives once new information comes to light, organizations realigning when truth becomes visible. Often, people move toward the side that represents clarity and justice once the situation becomes clear. Esther 8:17 highlights how dramatically circumstances can change once truth is revealed and leadership shifts. What began as fear under Haman's influence becomes joy and alignment under Mordecai's leadership. The story shows that when deception collapses and truth emerges, many people naturally move toward what is now recognized as right. Esther 9:1. Now in the 12th month, the day when the enemies of the Jews had hoped to gain power over them, the reverse occurred. The day that had been scheduled for the destruction of the Jewish people finally arrives. But instead of their enemies overpowering them, the situation reverses. The Jewish people gain the upper hand. This verse summarizes the entire theme of the book: reversal. The same day intended for destruction becomes the day of protection. The narrative shows how events can turn in unexpected ways. Sometimes, moments that appear destined for loss become turning points. Situations can change dramatically when truth is revealed or when leadership shifts. Esther 9 verse 2 to 5. The Jewish people defend themselves against those who attack them. Their enemies are defeated. The decree in chapter 8 gave them the right to defend themselves. Now that decree takes effect. What began as vulnerability becomes empowerment. Esther 9 verse 6 to 10. In the capital city of Susa, the enemies of the Jews are defeated, including the sons of Haman. The influence of Haman's household, which once threatened others, is now removed. The narrative continues the theme of dismantling the structure that supported the injustice. Esther 9 verse 11 to 12. These verses describe the defeat of Haman's sons, along with the enemies of the Jews. When read literally, it creates a tension with later prophetic teachings that say, children shall not bear the guilt of their parents. It's seen in Ezekiel 18, Jeremiah 31, Deuteronomy 24. Those passages emphasize individual responsibility rather than inherited guilt. When read symbolically, the defeat of Haman's household can represent the complete collapse of the system or influence that produced the injustice. The narrative can be seen as describing the removal of an entire oppressive structure. In storytelling terms, removing the household signals that the influence connected to Haman's plot has fully ended. Modern relatable example. In modern systems, when corruption is uncovered within an organization, the response may involve removing not only the individual responsible, but also dismantling the network that supported the wrongdoing. The focus is not necessarily on inherited guilt, but on removing the structure that allowed the injustice to occur. Esther 9 verse 13 to 15, the request is granted, and the Jewish people continue defending themselves in the capital. The story emphasizes the complete collapse of the plan that once threatened them. Esther 9:16, across the provinces, the Jewish people also defend themselves and gain relief from their enemies. The protection established in chapter 8 now reaches the entire empire. The restoration is not limited to one city. Esther 9:17. This was on the 13th day, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. After the conflict ends, the people rest and celebrate. The shift from conflict to rest symbolizes the completion of the struggle. People who once lived under fear now experience alignment and relief. Modern relatable meaning. After long periods of tension or crisis, communities often mark the end of the struggle with celebration. These celebrations acknowledge that a difficult chapter has passed. Esther 9 verse 18 to 19. The Jewish people in different cities begin commemorating the days of their deliverance. The memory of the event becomes institutionalized. Celebration turns into tradition. Esther 9:20 to 22. Mordecai writes letters establishing the festival of Purim. The festival commemorates the reversal of their situation. The name Purim comes from the pair or lot that Haman cast when choosing the day of destruction. The very method used to plan their destruction becomes the name of the celebration of their survival. Esther 9 verse 23 to 28. The Jewish community formally establishes Purim as a yearly observance. The story becomes part of collective memory. Future generations will remember the reversal. Esther 9 verse 29 to 32. Esther and Mordecai confirmed the celebration through official letters. Chapter 9 completes the story that began with fear and uncertainty. What began with a decree of destruction in chapter 3 ends with celebration and remembrance. The narrative reminds readers that circumstances that appear certain can sometimes change dramatically when truth is revealed. Courage is exercised and leadership shifts. The story closes with the community remembering the moment when what was meant for harm became a source of joy. Now we move on to the last chapter, chapter 10. Esther 10:1. King Ahasuerus imposed tribute throughout the empire. The chapter opens by mentioning the king's authority across the empire. The empire continued functioning after the events that unfolded. This verse shows stability returning to the system. After the political turmoil caused by Haman's plot, the empire resumes normal governance. The story closes by showing that the system did not collapse. Instead, it was reformed through a change in leadership and influence. Modern relatable example. After crisis in organizations or governments, systems often return to normal operations once leadership changes and problems are addressed. The story highlights the transition from crisis to stability. Esther 10:2. All the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai. The accomplishments of the king and Mordecai are recorded in the official chronicles of the empire. This reflects how important events are preserved in official records. The story emphasizes that Mordecai's rise and influence were recognized at the highest level. His actions become part of the historical memory of the empire. Modern parallel. Major political or organizational events are often documented in official records or archives so that future generations understand what occurred. Esther 10:3. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. Mordecai becomes one of the most powerful leaders in the empire. He is respected by many and works for the welfare of his people. The man who once sat quietly at the gates, Esther 2, now becomes second in command. This completes the final reversal of the story. The narrative arc shows a full transformation. Beginning, Mordecai was unnoticed at the gate. The end, Mordecai ruling beside the king. Beginning, Haman in power. Ending, Haman removed. Beginning, decree of destruction. Ending, decree of protection. Beginning, fear and mourning. Ending, celebration and stability. This reflects situations where individuals who act with integrity eventually gain influence and responsibility. Leadership transitions sometimes elevate people who previously worked quietly but demonstrated reliability and wisdom. The book of Esther ends not with conflict but with stability. The narrative shows how a hidden plot led to crisis. Courage revealed the truth, and leadership changes allowed restoration to take place. By the final chapter, the system that once threatened the Jewish people now operates under the influence of someone committed to their well-being. The story closes with a picture of reversal, restoration, and lasting influence. As we close our session today, the book of Esther leaves us with a powerful reminder. Systems of power often appear immovable. Policies can seem permanent. Injustice can appear deeply rooted. But the story of Esther shows us something remarkable. All it takes is the right moment and the courage of someone willing to stand in that moment. Esther did not begin her journey as a queen. She was an ordinary young woman living in exile. Yet through a series of events, she found herself positioned at the center of a moment that would change the future of her people. And when that moment arrived, she chose courage over silence. The book of Esther teaches us that influence is not always loud. Sometimes it moves quietly through wisdom, patience, and timing. And sometimes the very system designed to harm others eventually collapse under the weight of their own injustice. So, as we reflect on this story, the question the book leaves us with is simple. When the moment comes that requires courage, wisdom, and truth, will we recognize it? And will we be willing to stand in it? Thank you for being here today. And in our next session, we will continue exploring the deeper patterns hidden within the scriptures. Until then, may wisdom guide you, and may truth continue to unfold within your journey. Have a good night.